Thank you so much for joining us, Tom Albus, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District in Missouri. The Show Me Institute in the last year or so, we've been sort of digging in on the issues of public safety and criminal justice reform because it has occurred to us. I mean, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but one of our goals is to make Missouri a growth state where people want to raise their families and businesses want to come and open. And clearly, if our cities are perceived as being a place where you can't walk to your car at night and put your groceries away, then people won't want to do that. So we've been trying to understand mostly what's going on, mostly in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and have realized that a lot of the issue is a disconnect between what's actually happening in people's perceptions. People just perceive of St. Louis as a dangerous city. And so we've been trying to get our heads around that one. And I did a podcast recently with Doug Burris, and we talked about the issue. And he had some encouraging things to say about our prison system. But I just appreciate you coming on and giving us another perspective, because the most important thing for me is to try to understand this.
Thank you very much for having me. Uh, just to understand, I know Doug Burris very well and think very, very highly of him.
Yeah.
He ran the probation office here in federal court for many years. When I was an assistant U.S. attorney, I was a line prosecutor for many years before I got this job.
Yeah.
And immediately before I got this job, I was a circuit judge in St. Louis County. So I was a judge in the state system compared to the federal system. And Doug came and helped run the County Justice Center. And he's just a very innovative, thoughtful person. So I don't mean to argue with him, but, for example, Doug, one of the things that I listened to your podcast with Doug, and one of the things he was talking about is let's get people off probation faster, which is fine. But you might remember the example he used, like, well, what about the first degree robber? And what about the grandmother who cashed her deceased husband's Social Security check? Those shouldn't be treated the same, which of course they're not treated the same now. But, probation is a great alternative for somebody like perhaps that grandmother that cashed the deceased husband's check, rather than sending the grandmother to prison. But bear in mind, if you explain to Mr. and Mrs. John Q. Public, well, this lady cashed $75,000 worth of Social Security checks, do you want to do anything to her? I mean, we don't probably want to incarcerate that person, but then the alternative would be put them on probation and make sure that they pay the money back to the extent they can. So just one thought is that no one's suggesting treating that person the same as the violent criminal, but you do need to have people get accountability.
So what about this idea of applying a risk assessment when somebody's arrested or when someone's convicted, so that we are sure to lock up dangerous criminals and we are not trying to simply use building more prisons as our policy solution? I mean, I think that what we've tried to think about is, like, what's a more efficient use of the government of government resources when it comes to making people feel safer? What do you think is the way?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I mean, we use this risk assessment in St. Louis County, and a lot of the stuff is, I didn't learn any of this in law school or anything, but I did feel like it was common sense, in the sense that, well, does this person have a prior conviction? Well, that person's riskier to let out on bond before trial. Or is this person under a certain age? That person's riskier. So these social scientists create these risk factors. And frankly, it's something that I think intuitively anybody, whether they have legal training or not, would apply. So they're fine as far as they go. But when we were in St. Louis County, no matter how many priors the offender had, no matter how young they are, no matter how frequently they had priors, the recommendation was always, well, you're going to let this person on bond. It's just a matter of how many different accoutrements to the bond, how frequently do they have to check in, et cetera, et cetera. There was no part in the risk assessment where they said, oh, well, this person should be locked up before trial, which to me didn't seem sensible. Some people need to be detained before trial. And another thing that these risk assessments didn't take into account when I was looking over them was, what about the strength of the evidence against the person? Again, this is all just common sense, but what if the person was found by the police with the smoking gun over the body of the victim? Well, shouldn't you take that into account? But these risk factors don't take that into account. And a lot of times the risk assessment tools are being pushed by NGO foundations that, if you look at their website, say it's our goal to get everybody out of prison or to vastly. So again, these are not chemistry experiments. These are not, chemical reactions. It's social science, and everybody has a point of view that should be considered. But you have to consider the point of view of some of these groups that are pushing, oh, let's reform the how probation credit is counted, or let's add these risk assessments because, everybody has their point of view in the criminal justice system.
So what is the reality with the prison population in Missouri? Is it growing or is it declining?
No, I believe, and I'll have to check these, but I believe that the Missouri Department of Corrections, that's the people in prison in the state of Missouri, is roughly 1/3 less than it was 10 years ago. I believe the United States Bureau of Prisons, so those are the people in prison for federal crimes, is 1/4 less than what it was 10 years ago, between COVID and just a different approach and the First Step Act, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I know that you are very interested in educational policy. What if we had a 1/3 increase in fourth grade reading scores in Missouri? Everybody would be pretty happy with that, but they wouldn't be pushing, But here we have these great statistics. I mean, to the extent everything else being equal, if crime is the same and the prison population is down, everybody wants that. But is crime down, and is crime down to a level that we're satisfied with it being down?
And is it? I mean,
Well, yeah.
people are talking all over the place, including the leadership in St. Louis, about how much crime is down. But again, when we've talked to just man on the street, or we've had some public events, people don't feel like crime is down. People still see panhandling and graffiti and public disorder. People still don't really want to park their car and walk to a baseball game downtown, or, everyone just knows that you leave your car unlocked because you're going to get a smash and grab. Like, there isn't a perception that St. Louis feels safer.
Right, and think about regionally, it's a complex situation regionally. The city of St. Louis, to its credit, has reduced homicides from in the mid 200s in 2020 to, I believe it was 140 in 2025. So that's 50 homicides per 100,000 people. The national average is in the high single digits, so it's still very elevated in the city of St. Louis. The national rate is, I'm going to say, somewhere of the order of 7, 8, or 9 per 100,000. Now you go across Skinker to St. Louis County, where I was a judge, and we're sitting at roughly the national average in the high single digits in St. Louis County. And a trend that you don't hear very much is that that's a much elevated trend over the last 10 to 15 years in St. Louis County, maybe 2x, 3x higher than it was 10 to 15 years ago in St. Louis County. Now, then you go across the Missouri River to St. Charles County, and they're looking at about 1 murder per 100,000 people. So it's a big difference as you proceed west on Highway 70, and one size doesn't necessarily fit all.
What's been going on in St. Louis County that it's gone up?
Well, I don't really know. I just think that, I don't know the source of it, but we are dealing with a lot more violent crime in St. Louis County than we did, say, 20 years ago. For example, in St. Louis County, even though we've got approximately 4 times more people living in St. Louis County than live in St. Louis City, we only have about 1/3 as many homicides every year as the city of St. Louis. But yet, we've got 200 plus people awaiting trial for a homicide in St. Louis County. And I know that's something that's really the focus of the prosecutor's office, and rightly so. But we've just seen, they didn't have the capacity 20 years ago to handle the rate of homicides that they're seeing in St. Louis County. And this backlog is a consequence of that, in my view.
Plus, clearance rates haven't really improved. So a lot of the crimes identified as murders aren't getting solved.
Well, if you look at, I think the city of St. Louis Police Department would say that their clearance rate has gone up quite a bit, and those are statistics that the city updates every day on the St.
Yeah.
Louis City Police Department website. And at some points, they've recorded a clearance rate of over 100% in the last year because they're solving historical cases in addition to the cases as they come in. So they've gotten their clearance rate very high. And that's very important too. Not only how long you're going to sentence someone, but people need to understand that if you commit an offense, that you're going to be called to account. So Chief Tracy in the city is proud of his clearance rate going up, and he's right to do that.
What's your thoughts on mandatory minimums when
Uh,
judges have discretion?
Again, mandatory minimums exist in state and federal crime, but certainly in the state court, you could say, well, someone is in prison for second degree murder and they're subject to a mandatory minimum of 10 years. That's true, but I don't think that's the mandatory minimums that people are really thinking about. There's very, very few people incarcerated in the state of Missouri Department of Corrections that are there only because of a mandatory minimum that the judge would prefer to have sentenced below, but he or she wasn't able to do that because of a mandatory minimum. There was a lot of that when I first became an assistant U.S. attorney 25 years ago with the crack cases, and you could get a 5-year mandatory minimum for a very small amount of crack. Of course, that was passed by Congress in the Criminal Justice Act of 1994, and those ratios have been changed by Congress since then. But again, people will talk about nonviolent offenders, and it's just something to think about. A drug dealer, to me, is not a nonviolent offender. We're not talking about crack anymore as much. We're talking about fentanyl, and everybody knows what happens when you come into contact with fentanyl, and the it's basically 1,747 a day of Americans who die from fentanyl overdoses. I would consider that a violent crime. To not to mention the fact that oftentimes firearms and violence go along with drug dealing, but dealing fentanyl alone, I guess the point is the whole point of my visit with you is just to say these are not easy questions to answer. But if somebody came into your neighborhood and was dealing out fentanyl to anybody and who wanted it and had money to pay, I would be concerned. Maybe strictly speaking, that's not a violent crime, but it's a very, very dangerous antisocial crime.
So you see these groups, nonprofits, NGOs that are maybe, I talked about it on my podcast, that are saying, look, let's clear the prisons, let's put more people on ankle monitors, let's stop just building, Arkansas is going to build $1 billion prison. There's a lot of like massive prisons being built. And there are a lot of foundations that are like, we could be smarter about this. And it sounds like you don't completely align with that thinking.
Well, just everybody should know where everyone is coming from. I think, you probably recall about 10 years ago, I guess it was when Governor Parson first became governor. I'm not sure about that. But Missouri was in the same boat. They were saying we didn't have a lot of money
Yeah.
and certainly not a lot of money to build new prisons in the state of Missouri. And Governor Parson said, we're just not going to go down that road. And, as I said, we were able to reduce our DOC population in Missouri substantially by a third. And the need for those new prisons has gone away. And statistically speaking, we're doing better in 2026 than we did in 2020, notwithstanding the fact that we have one third fewer people in prison. So that's a good thing. But if you come in and say, well, look, we're a certain foundation and we have this risk assessment tool and it's just science, there's nothing to it other than science, then I just suggest to all your listeners go to the website of this foundation and see what their mission statement says. Again, this is social science. This is not physics or chemistry or biology. Everybody has their political point of view, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we just need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that it's just a no-brainer. You use this risk assessment and you let everybody off probation and everything's going to get better. Plus, it's going to be cheaper and it's a win-win-win. I just don't subscribe to that.
I definitely saw a case that was not in Missouri of a guy who was accused of, it was a terrible case. involving a child, but his risk assessment was very low. And the nature of the crime was terrible, but he
Sure.
was allowed out and reoffended. I did remember reading about that case thinking the risk assessment did not do its job because of the nature, it didn't pick up this particular person's potential for criminality. But, I wonder then in a world with finite resources, what do we do to make St. Louisans feel safer?
That's what's so thorny about it. And as when I was sitting as a judge, sometimes I'd think, well, what would my wife think, or what would my mother think, or what would my friend think about this particular person, risk assessment tool aside. And for example, if someone's on bond for a felony and then they're arrested for a new felony, that gets them a point on the risk assessment. But I think a lot of Missourians would say, well, I don't care what you get 1 point or 10 points or 30 points. If we've already let you out on bond and then you committed a new offense, that's it.
That's it.
You're not going to get
One
another
strike.
chance.
Yeah.
And again, but then we get into, well, was it a violent crime? Well, if he stole a car on Monday and then you're out on Wednesday and you steal a car next Monday, it's just as kind of a, well, we can't brook that. We can't do that because it's absurd. I think some people are at least entitled to have that opinion. And even though it's contrary to what is supposedly following the science.
So do we put more discretion in the hands of judges to make
Well,
those
and they
changes?
have them. I mean, again, I don't think anyone's suggesting saying, you follow this assessment and the judge can't override the assessment. I overrode it all the time, and my colleagues overrode it all the time because that's the role of the judge. One thing that came up, you may have followed, there was a juvenile assessment tool that was basically followed frequently, and the juvenile officer or the judge was very loath to go against the risk assessment for the juvenile. And that's something that got the police up in arms, and there may have been some legislation around that. But again, the judge is always able to, certainly should always be able to go against the risk assessment. And again, as I talked about earlier, what about if you have a written confession? There's no question that the person did that. I mean, you're presumed innocent at trial, but we can weigh the facts against you in terms of setting the bond in the case.
Yeah, I think my biggest beef with the perception of public safety in St. Louis, when I lived right by where you just mentioned, I lived between Skinker and Delmar range, um, was just a lack of the rule of law around me. I felt like people ran stop signs, ran stoplights, and therefore people did smash and grabs and and it was just like made a crime and got on the Metrolink. And we just all kind of agree that the Metrolink stations feel really dangerous. We've all just kind of accepted that we have to keep all our floodlights on the outside of our house. And I just feel like living in the city of St. Louis, which I love, the city of St. Louis, you just have this tolerance for the fact that the crime's going to happen around you and there's nothing you can do about it. And I just didn't feel like what I witnessed, like the police were really enforcing these small things, and then criminals were getting away with big things too. And I just wonder what the fix is for that.
Right. And another thing that's certainly being debated is you can't, you need police officers. And we
Yeah.
have perhaps 50% fewer police officers policing the city of St. Louis than we did 10 years ago. And that's not a good thing. I just am in you can't beat having police officers in your neighborhood. And when I was in AUSA and I would go up to neighborhoods, um, to the neighborhood meeting and say, and try to be there and be present and understand what's going on, I never heard anybody saying, we want fewer police in our neighborhood. I always heard people of every stripe and every neighborhood saying, we want more police and this corner is a problem and please take care of this. And it's a challenge for the city of St. Louis, and I wish nothing but the best for them to get as many more police officers as they can.
Yeah, that and 911 I think is a bit of a problem too. And people complain about not being able to get through. We have
Absolutely.
like 28 different systems, and the city county line and all that is very confusing. I mean, I know that the talks of merging the two together always uh, result in nothing, but I think that also like you just mentioned, the difference in the murder rate between on one side of the line and on the other side of the line, right? It's something needs to be done to fix that. But
And
it's
if I always go by the murder rate because, those all get called in. There's also
yeah.
a difference between how frequently a car break-in might get called in at different areas of our region. And so you can't necessarily rely on those statistics, but homicides get called in, and homicides are a good indicator of the overall safety of a community, to be sure.
So so generally, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? Or is there anything that you would change within the probation and pretrial and prison system?
Well, and again, no one likes to think about building more prisons because
Right.
it's very expensive and it's kind of the last tool that you have in the toolbox. But for example, in the city of St. Louis, they took out of service and then knocked down the medium security institution known as the workhouse. That's not available anymore. And so the only place that state court judges in the city have to put offenders that are being detained pretrial is the Justice Center downtown, and that's at capacity. So I would want a lot more police officers, and I probably would want some more places to put the real repeat offenders, the antisocial people, certainly the violent people, so they are incapacitated and out of our community. People that commit Class A felonies, Class B felonies, or people that commit new felonies while they're on probation or parole or pretrial detention. There are people that do that and then they still get bond because we're out of places to put these people. And again, as we all know, we're talking about a very, very small percentage of our community that is committing these serious crimes. And, and then we could go back to just, having people get more social capital in the community and people looking out for them and not letting them as teenagers or young people, just be directionless. I think you see a lot of that when you sit in a courtroom in the city or county, that people just don't have a plan for their lives and they don't have people sitting in the courtroom supporting them. That's what I would really change.
Yeah, you said I mostly do study education policy, and St. Louis Public Schools has got a chronic absenteeism rate of like 55%, and I don't really think they even know where those kids are. And until we fix some of those things and somebody's keeping track of these teenagers, then I don't see their propensity for just committing crime to go down. I believe that that's in the ordering of things. First, you fix the education system, but um, and you fix it before they get to the criminal justice system. But it's unfortunately we don't have that right now in St. Louis. Well, I appreciate you coming on and giving a different perspective. I have heard more than one person, not just Doug Burris, say that this risk assessment is going to be the way to fix the problem. And it's good to, hear a different perspective that it comes with a lot of caveats, minimally.
Right. Well, there's a lot of good people working on this problem, but it's just not a problem that has a silver bullet that I've seen in 25 years.
Yeah, good to know. Well, thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thanks for having me.